Oh, okay. Welcome everybody. My name is Jonathon O'Donnell, and today I'm going to be talking to you about a broad area of my research, kind of just doing a general overview. Um, a lot of the stuff that I talk about today, I go into in more depth, both in other talks and in my various publications. So feel free to look at those or message me if you want further elaboration beyond the scope of this talk. So today I'm going to be talking about, as the title of the talk suggests, the intersections between demonology, conspiracism, and Christian nationalism in contemporary America. I'll spend most of this talk doing kind of general overview of this, and then towards the end, I'll talk more specifically about um, the way that this manifests in relationship to the Trump presidency, as we are kind of heading into the second Trump presidency at this point after a kind of 4 year interregnum. So like I'm going to be kind of talking a bit about the forces that were kind of galvanized and operated kind of within that first term or around that first term and how those have kind of continued and will continue looking forward. So to begin with, I want to talk briefly about an event that a lot of you will be familiar with if you follow the news, which was the events of January the 6th, 2021, when a number of pro-Trump supporters marched on Washington, D.C., and sort of stormed the Capitol building um, in order to, in order to essentially like reinstate Trump as president due to the belief that the election had been stolen, specifically by Joe Biden, but not only by Joe Biden, as we will kind of see. Um, so this is an event that got a lot of coverage in the news at the time and kind of since. I recently contributed to a special issue of the journal Nova Religio, which is focused on January 6th specifically. That's open access, so anyone can kind of access both my article and the other excellent articles in the issue to read. But an event that got less attention at the time was one that took place about a month before January the 6th, which was this event. The Jericho March on Washington, associated with the Let the Church Roar prayer rally to be held at the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and in association with the concept of Stop the Steal, the idea that the election had been stolen. So, what is the Jericho March? I guess is probably the best place to start here. Jericho March is a practice within contemporary Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity that involves large numbers of Christians going to a specific place and conducting a series of ritual prayers, often kind of circumambulating the building or the area in question. Sometimes this also will involve the blowing of Jewish ritual horns or shofars, which ties into a kind of broader kind of Christian Zionist undercurrent in contemporary evangelicalism, which I probably won't have time to go into today. Um, but essentially, the idea is modeled on the story of Jericho from the Bible, in which the Hebrews circumambulated the walls 7 times, blowing their ritual horns, and then the walls came crumbling down, and they were able to kind of conquer the city. The modern idea of the Jericho March in evangelical and Pentecostal Christianity kind of draws on this narrative and frames it in a more spiritual sense. The idea that through this kind of act of circumambulation, through prayer, through the blowing of horns, they are able to kind of spiritually bring down the walls of Jericho around the edifice or the institution that they're kind of targeting in this. In specifically this one, they targeted the Supreme Court, the Capitol building, Congress, various other kind of political and judicial institutions in Washington, D.C. That they had framed as stealing the election from Trump for Biden, specifically in league with dark demonic spiritual forces that they saw as kind of underlying a lot of the kind of political moments in the United States at the time. And this kind of gets me into the main topic of my talk, which is the relationship between demonology, conspiracy theories, and the kind of broader Christian nationalist movement in America today. The Jericho March is a practice that is fairly prevalent within what is known today as the kind of neo-Pentecostal or charismatic movement, and specifically in relation to practices of spiritual warfare, which is the main focus of my study. So broadly, what is spiritual warfare? Spiritual warfare is a belief system that's fairly old in Christianity, that believes that spiritual forces underlie and influence the kind of material conditions of life. Sean McLeod, in his kind of study of spiritual warfare, American Possessions, frames it as a supernatural hermeneutics of suspicion. The idea that like all kind of extant phenomena, from institutions to ideologies to the rise and fall of nations to familial trauma to like a number of other things, are essentially material manifestations of an underlying spiritual base, which is the conflict between good and evil on the spiritual plane. Good and evil, God and the devil, angels and demons, etc. As a result of this, spiritual warfare literature, which is the kind of primary focus of my research, is aimed at a number of audiences. Primarily, they will be targeted at already believing Christians. Spiritual warfare texts tend not to be aimed with the aim of conversion, for example. But they tend to be designed to inform believers about, one, the reality of the demonic, as like a real spiritual force that exists in the world, and two, how the demonic operates in through the material plane, through the realms of kind of society and politics, but also through kind of interpersonal relationships, through the family, through individual destructive patterns, through community community poverty or addiction and things like that. Contemporary spiritual warfare literature, in my analysis, and I've kind of unfortunately managed to read a lot of these works over the last 15 years at this point, falls into kind of what I see as kind of three broad camps, or rather along a continuum of like one extreme to the other. So on one end, you have books like this one. This is a book by Cindy Jacobs, who's one of the kind of founders of modern spiritual warfare. The book is titled The Supernatural Life: Experience the Power of God in Your Everyday Life. This is effectively a form of self-help book. It is designed to instruct the believer in how to deal with various kind of problems they may be facing. This could be issues of depression, maybe like tensions in their marriages, tensions within their family, with their children or with their parents, tensions within their church community, very localized, very personal. And instructing the believers that the root cause behind these tensions, these troubles in their lives, are fundamentally demonic forces that have gained access to the individual's life, and or like immediate circumstances through a variety of measures that can result from, say, like behavior on the part of the individual that's marked as like sinful by practitioners, but it can also be inherited. Like it could be something that your parents did or your ancestors did. One very common narrative that you get in these kinds of texts is the idea that even if the individual believer is kind of faithful and true and hasn't committed any sin, they may have inherited like an object from a loved one or a grandparent that carries a like demonic influence within it. So you'll have, for example, stories about like discovering their grandfather's Masonic signet ring in the attic, and then like, and how this was the object that allowed demonic influence to enter their home, for example. But primarily, these are kind of books that are very self-help focused, very focused on individuals, or like immediate familial or like familial or kind of work networks, like churches, workplaces, friendship groups, etc. On the other end of the spectrum, you have books like this one. This was published in 2010. Um, these are both from kind of roughly the same era. These are all books that are the books that I'm talking about here were all published in the kind of 2000 to 2010 range. Supernatural Life, I believe, is 2005, for example. But this is Thomas and Nita Horn's book, Forbidden Gates. It has a very long subtitle that is How Genetics, Robotics, Artificial Intelligence, Synthetic Biology, Nanotechnology, and Human Enhancement Herald the Dawn of Techno-Dimensional Spiritual Warfare. This is very different from Jacobs's The Supernatural Life. It looks at emerging technologies, at global politics, at like ideal. This book specifically is focused on the idea of transhumanism and like technological and ideological changes in that the authors see in the modern world. And they discern an underlying spiritual darkness, like demonic entities that are kind of underlying these broad social and like ideological and technological movements in the world today. So essentially, this book is kind of focused on almost like macro politics. Horn's other books that I'll talk briefly about later also kind of emphasize ideas of the kind of global New World Order, ideas of kind of national destiny. It's very focused on like big picture politics and like big picture technology. Um, but operates with the same underlying principles of Jacobs's book in that it's about discerning and exploring this underlying kind of spiritual conflict that the authors see as underlying all of these elements. In the middle, however, you have books like Stealth Attack by Ray Pritchard here. This was published in 2007. This book is ostensibly very close to Jacobs. It's primarily a self-help book, as the subtitle suggests. It's about protecting yourself against Satan's plan to destroy your life. Very personal framing. One of the interesting things about this book specifically, however, is that it draws very closely on at the ongoing, at the time, like US war on terror, specifically the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, in order to frame and reconceptualize the demonic for like the audience that the book is trying to reach. For example, it talks about demons as kind of terrorist cells. It talks about Satan as operating through a framework of asymmetrical warfare against the kind of divine omnipotence and omnipresence of God, in a way that very much draws close analogies between divine power and kind of US military strength and the kind of alignments of the demonic with America's ostensible enemies, specifically here, like Muslim and terrorists from Muslim majority countries. And I'll talk a bit more about that and that kind of war on terror framing, specifically regarding Islam, in a bit. But these are kind of two poles of spiritual warfare texts and like a book that kind of sits in the middle, close to one and then the other. We'll talk about some of the other books later that fall maybe closer to the kind of macro political conspiracist kind of pole. But anyway, this is a kind of general overview of the landscape of spiritual warfare. So how did we get here? I guess is kind of where I want to kind of go from this. Like, how did modern spiritual warfare develop? Spiritual warfare as a concept is very old in Christianity. It goes right back to the founding of the religion. Um, it was very prominent during, say, the Christianization of Rome, where Christians would use prayer and various ritual actions to kind of attempt to dethrone the pagan deities that they saw as ruling over the cities of, say, Greece and Rome and Anatolia and various other kind of regions at the time, in order to kind of instantiate Christianity as the kind of new dominant religion. On the other hand, you also have practices of spiritual warfare with Christian monks, where they would kind of journey out into the wilderness in order to kind of battle demons, the demons being understood as having fled into the wilderness after they were chased out of the cities through Christianizing processes. And there they would do battle with demons, kind of on the model of Jesus going into the wilderness to battle to kind of combat the devil, in order to kind of temper themselves into these kind of perfect singular warriors for kind of God. So you have those old ideas of spiritual warfare. Modern spiritual warfare doesn't have, while it draws on, say, similar scriptures or like similar ideas, because there is a kind of broad continuity of the idea of the demonic in Christianity with its various kind of ups and downs. The modern idea of spiritual warfare derives primarily from a group in the mid-1980s that I've written about, and myself and others have written about a lot, called the New Apostolic Reformation. Sometimes referred to as the third wave of the Holy Spirit, which was the term they used for themselves, conceptualizing themselves as this third wave of religious revival that had kind of succeeded the Pentecostal revivals of the early 20th century, and then the kind of charismatic revivals of the kind of post-war period in America. These groups saw themselves as kind of the next step of this process. These groups are primarily based around a group of American missionaries who were based institutionally in Pasadena in California. They did a lot of missionary work in Central and South America, particularly like Argentina. And I think Argentina was like their main base. They may have also done work in Bolivia, various other locations. But these groups are kind of important because one of the things they came to conceptualize through their missionary work into essentially the global South was the idea that they were actively facing kind of hostile spiritual forces that they identified both with kind of the Catholicism that was practiced in Latin America, because these are kind of Protestant missionaries, at least at this point in time. And also kind of various kind of indigenous spirits or deities that they saw as kind of still holding sway. And unlike many kind of mainstream conceptions of Christianity today, that like mainline Christianities that conceptualize non-Christian deities as essentially a kind of false or empty idol, the idea that those entities kind of lack, I guess, ontological substance, they lack being. These individuals, through their missionary work, came to believe that non-Christian spiritual entities were in fact very real, but they were also very hostile to Christianity, and so they came to be identified very strongly with the demonic, with ideas of demons. And so these individuals set out to write a number of books after they returned to the United States, instructing various other Christians on the reality of the demonic, but also how the demonic worked, how it operated. And this kind of leads into one of the other kind of core concepts that this movement kind of starts, which is the idea of territorial spirits, the idea that demons are not only real, but they are they hold sway in specific kind of geographical or geopolitical spaces. These spaces can vary. They can be kind of an individual house in the idea of kind of the haunted house, the kind of classic haunted house that has like demonic influence in it. Books like Eddie and Alice Smith's Spiritual House Cleaning here are kind of deal more directly with that. But this could also range more broadly to say neighborhoods, communities, like entire cities, sometimes entire nations or continents. And we'll kind of talk a bit later about the ideas of national destiny and national direction that kind of come into this. So the idea is here that like demons are spatially located, they are real, they are hostile to Christianity, and in their hostility, they push a variety of what the authors see as kind of not anti-Christian agendas. These can be anything, these can be and we'll talk about in a moment what they can be: feminism, LGBT rights, non-evangelical forms of religion such as Islam, Judaism, Wicca, even Catholicism, if you're in the particularly anti-Catholic strands of these movements, although there's a lot less anti-Catholicism today than there was, say, in the 80s, in these movements, for reasons I'll kind of touch on later. But essentially, the idea is that like demons are real. They must be combated through prayer and through political actions that can kind of dethrone them in specific locations. And through doing so, uh, areas and nations and cities are able to be spiritually transformed to align more closely with what these individuals believe is kind of true or legitimate Christianity, which tends to be socially conservative, very much aligned with ideas of the American nation as a kind of bastion of kind of goodness and moral strength in the world. Ideas like that. They're very closely aligned with ideas of American exceptionalism. Often, a lot of the time, even though they like pitch themselves as global movements. And so now I want to talk about a number of the kind of examples of how this plays out. Kind of, I want to look a bit about ideas of Jezebel and how that plays out, their constructions of Islam and how those became influenced by the U.S. war on terror, and then the kind of moving into the intersections of more overt kind of conspiracy culture with these movements. Okay, so Jezebel is one of the various spiritual entities that these authors have liked to talk about from fairly early on. These are a number of books published over a wide range of years. John Paul Jackson's Unmasking the Jezebel Spirit and Francis Frangipane's The Jezebel Spirit were both published in the 1990s. Rebecca Greenwood's Dethroning the Queen of Heaven over here was a very recent publication, either this year or last year, I believe it came out. The others are all published in the kind of late 2000s, early 2010s kind of range. But basically, these are kind of books that share a broad series of concerns and associations. The Jezebel spirit is a spirit that the idea of a demonic spirit that is modeled on the biblical figure of Jezebel. So the idea here is that Jezebel, the character in the Bible, who was just a flesh and blood woman, at least within the historical narratives of these individuals, was either not necessarily possessed by, but heavily influenced by, and becomes archetypical of a particular demonic entity that, as a result, comes to be known as the Jezebel spirit. This spirit is sometimes talked about in other ways. Sometimes it's identified with the goddess Ashtoreth from the ancient Near East, or the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, or like various other figures. But Jezebel comes to kind of main concern within these groups during the 1990s, often in relationship to both the shifting gender and sexual relations within America during the 1990s, particularly in the association, in the relation, but also globalization. It's very common in spiritual warfare literature to see Jezebel associated very strongly with Hillary Clinton, for example. And this is an association that goes back to the 90s. Like if you look at kind of the rise of corporate feminism in the 1990s and the kind of 1990s American pop culture, there's very much the idea of Clinton as this archetype of the kind of empowered new woman within American popular culture at the time. The idea of kind of shifting gender relations, of more kind of equal political and powerful partnerships. Um, and they very much draw on this kind of broader cultural narrative to cast Hillary Clinton as like an avatar of the Jezebel spirit, as this figure that is overthrowing traditional patriarchal gender norms, but also is kind of pushing this agenda of kind of increased globalization, of like the kind of the processes of kind of neoliberal globalization that come about. The way I came to understand Jezebel, like through my research, is that she very much represents these ideas of the kind of improper or distorted boundaries between things. So, for example, like at least in the kind of mindsets of the people writing. So, for example, she'll represent kind of non-patriarchal forms of family relationship, for example. She'll represent um, gay and trans rights, for example, the idea of the kind of the breakdown of cis-normative gender boundaries, but also kind of heteronormative sexual boundaries. But then she'll also be closely associated with, say, like abuse patterns, the idea of individuals having toxic interpersonal relationships with each other. She's associated with the globalization, the breakdown of the kind of national boundaries. She's sometimes associated with ideas of addiction or like cross-border drug trafficking, ideas of the nation and the individual as kind of permeable and able to be kind of influenced by outside sources. And like Jezebel very much comes to kind of represent a cluster of these anxieties around gender and the nation during this period in a way that kind of continues to feed through to today. Jezebel is still a very popular subject within contemporary charismatic evangelical demonology writings. She was very much associated with Hillary Clinton again during 2016, and much more recently associated with Kamala Harris in the most recent um, presidential election in America. But one of the thing I wanted to kind of think about here is the way that this drew on anxieties around shifting political norms in America and the way that spiritual warfare often mirrors and draws on, but also reshapes these kind of broader political boundaries. And one of the good examples of the way this works is in spiritual warfare discourse about Islam. Um, so Islam as a focus of spiritual warfare really kind of starts in the 1990s. There isn't really much writing in the 80s. The 80s, you're dealing with the tail end of the Cold War. There's a lot of focus on communism as kind of the big threat. And then after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there's this kind of search within spiritual warfare movements for basically a new enemy, like a big bad that they can kind of frame a lot of their ideological kind of focus towards. And Islam kind of increasingly comes to take up this image of the kind of the enemy in for a lot of writings. But I also think it's interesting in that it is often far more fractured. You'll have some authors that will focus on Islam. You'll have others that will focus on Jezebel or gender and sexuality more broadly. You'll have some that focus on both. You'll have some that focus on ideas of secularism specifically as a threat. But anyway, so in the 1990s, very little was written from in spiritual warfare on Islam. Um, the Last of the Giants by George Otis and Inside Islam by Reza Safa are some of the only kind of examples of this in the period. They didn't sell very well. They weren't very popular. Um, uh, but this very much radically changed after 9/11. Um, here are some books that came about in the kind of immediate aftermath. Pretty much all of these are published in the 2000s, mostly from kind of 2004 onwards. Um, and this came like this, and this kind of came to become a bit of an industry within evangelical publishing at the time, particularly around ideas of the demonic, ideas of kind of prophecy in the end times. Ralph Stice's From 9/11 to 666 is a kind of archetypical example here. This indeed begins with an entire chapter of speculative fiction writing about the coming downfall of America in the then distant days of, I believe, 2017. Um, about America's takeover by like a Muslim antichrist figure who would institute Sharia law and like destroy American freedom. And by it's kind of fascinating actually. Like he does that. One of the things he does is he like starts taxing like executives and like gives everybody Friday off work for to go to mosque. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know why this sounds so terrible to Americans at the time, but I guess this is pre-recession 2004, so you know. But anyway, um, this trend really kicks off in 2007 with the publication of Joel Richardson's Antichrist, Islam's Awaited Messiah. which is then later republished as The Islamic Antichrist by WorldNet Daily, and goes on to become a New York Times bestseller. It like sells quite extensively, and really kickstarts a lot of this industry. Ralph Stice, in a 2012 book that he writes in relationship to the Arab Spring, very, very bitter that Richardson's book took off and his didn't, despite the fact his was like 3 years earlier, which I always think is slightly amusing. Um, but essentially, like these books all focus on the idea of Islam as like this great threat to American hegemony, the hegemony of like the West or the Judeo-Christian West as like a framework, and more sort of generally like just kind of American and Christian, American evangelical Christian specifically, kind of power in the region. Um, it's also very conspiratorial in its framework. It often relies heavily on ideas of global influence, on ideas of kind of conspiracies around migration, around infiltration of institutions by quote unquote like Muslim sleeper agents, for example. There's a very strong like conspiratorial focus that starts to come into these works, and that kind of brings me on to the more directly stuff, to more directly talk about conspiracism and spiritual warfare more generally. And I want to do this through a brief case study of one kind of publishing house or network that I kind of talk about a lot in my research, which is a Missouri-based media ministry called Skywatch TV. Skywatch is not particularly influential or important. They do publish extensively, but I think they're a really good example of some of the more like fringe aspects of spiritual warfare, and also how those fringe aspects increasingly like feed into the kind of more mainstream spiritual warfare discourse, but then also more kind of mainstream reactionary Christianity in general. So one of these is Thomas Horn's book, The Invisible Invasion. Thomas Horn is the founder of Skywatch TV. He published this in 1998, and it's very concerned with the kind of state of American culture and American society. He talks a lot about American decline, for example. It very much fits into kind of broader like end of the century discourses of American decline, fitting into the kind of American Jeremiah tradition. The idea that it's kind of lapsed in its faithfulness to God, for example. He then goes on to write a number of other books, and to found a publishing house that publishes a number of both his own books, but also books by authors that are kind of generally aligned with him. Here are two. One I talked about earlier is Forbidden Gates. The other here is Exo Vaticana, which was a book he co-authored and specifically is about intersections of kind of UFO discourse with kind of anti-Catholic sentiment, the idea that the Catholic Church is an institution, which he very specifically distances from like Catholics as individuals. And this ties into contemporary like anti-Francis specifically like discourse within these groups. Is like in league with either alien forces or demonic forces that are pretending to be aliens, depending on the work in question. He also goes on to write a lot about national destiny and specifically like the state of America. Specifically in this book, which is Apollyon Rising 2012, which he publishes in 2009, and is broadly focused here on the idea of kind of America's Masonic heritage. America is like beset, but also in league with occult forces, and this idea of this kind of tension within America between this kind of occult underbelly that he associates with like basically with the founders of the US state, and then the kind of this also Christian element, the kind of Christian nation of America, which he associates with the Pilgrims, and the idea that these are kind of two trajectories or tensions within the US nation, and which one is going to win out and kind of determine America's role in the kind of coming end times. Obviously 2012 rolls around and not much happens in this, so he then republishes the book as Zenith 2016. And then 2016 comes around, and then he republishes it again as Zeitgeist 2025. Horn himself has passed away in the last couple of years, so he won't be able to update this again next year when things don't go the way he presumably intends them again, or intended them at least. Um, Here are some other books that he's published, one by some of his associates and contributors, which sort of ties broadly into the idea of UFOs, of old gods returning, of the idea of kind of demons as working behind kind of contemporary ufology and things like that. But then the one at the bottom, Saboteurs, which he wrote during Trump's first presidency, which is a kind of collection of essays by him and his associates, which is specifically on ideas of the deep state and ideas of kind of the idea of the shadow government, like undermining Trump's political agenda kind of during this period. But one of the most noticeable books that he published was this one, Mark Taylor's The Trump Prophecies, which is published in 2017. This book is a book essentially by Mark Taylor, who is a former firefighter, who basically retired due to PTSD. And then, according to his narrative, in about 2011 or 2012, he starts to receive visions from God that tell him that Trump is going to be the US president. Um, he claims there are records of these. I've been unable to find any records of these predating the publication of the book in 2017. So how much you want to buy into his own narrative. But more specifically, Taylor became a bit of a celebrity during the early Trump presidency, specifically due to a whole number of reasons that I want to kind of talk about now. Um, and this is kind of the kind of main section of the talk. So apologies for rambling on a bit. So Trump's victory in 2016 took a lot of his evangelical supporters by surprise. Very few of them believed that he was actually going to win. Most of them had this narrative that Clinton was going to win and then cement kind of this narrative of American decline, in which like things would get worse. Evangelical Christians would be persecuted, and generally the nation would kind of enter a period of, in their view, kind of moral and spiritual decline, which would culminate either in the Second Coming, or in a kind of a Christian reassertion within American public and political life. But Trump's victory was quite unexpected for a lot of them. And so a lot of them start looking for narratives to explain and justify his victory, but also to explain and justify their own conversion to kind of Trump's cause. And that's the thing you see a lot in the kind of literature in this period. So these are kind of several books. The ones on the right, so you see God and Donald Trump, Trumpocalypse, God's Chaos Candidate. All of these books deal quite heavily with their authors coming to like Trump's agenda. A lot of them start off as supporters of, say, Mike Huckabee or Ted Cruz, like other more kind of overtly evangelical Republican candidates, and only really later kind of get on the Trump train. And a lot of these parts of these books are dedicated very strongly to the idea of like why Trump wins them over, but then also like why evangelicals should support Trump. And God's Chaos Candidate by Warnow is perhaps a very quintessential example of this. Um, he essentially puts forward the idea that whether Trump is a believer or not is essentially immaterial. What's important is that God, as kind of omnipotent sovereign of the universe, is utilizing Trump as a tool to enact a kind of Christian agenda in America. Warnell specifically uses the metaphor of Cyrus from the Bible, the king who, the Persian king who liberated the Jews from Babylon and then helped kind of build the Second Temple in Jerusalem, with the idea that Trump is much like Cyrus himself, potentially a non-believer, who God is still using for a prophetic purpose to kind of reshape American public and political life in accordance with the desires of like this group of kind of evangelical and charismatic Christians who choose to support him. The Trump prophecy here is, I think, one example of how this agenda coalesced. This is actually a movie poster. The book by Mark Taylor was turned into a kind of a biopic slash propaganda film by Liberty University's kind of film department. The first kind of 2/3 of the movie are a fairly straightforward adaptation of Taylor's narrative, his firefighting history, his retirement, the way he kind of becomes beset by some slightly bad CG demons in his sleep, for example, who are trying to lure him away from his divine mission, his seeing Donald Trump on the TV and God kind of speaking to him to tell him that Trump is going to be president, and then the kind of political activism that Taylor kind of gets into as a result of this. But the last third of the movie, the story ends at the 2/3 mark, and the last section of the movie is a series of interviews with pro-Trump evangelicals about their kind of hopes and aspirations for the Trump presidency and what the Trump presidency brings to their agendas, but also in their view, kind of Christian agendas more broadly in America. This kind of continues through a number of kind of spiritual warfare and other evangelical publications that come out in the intervening years, kind of between the start of Trump's presidency and now. These are all books that are published by Charisma House, which is the publishing house owned by Stephen Strang, which is a very prominent evangelical, charismatic, conservative publishing house in America. These are all from their Frontline series, which is an imprint within Charisma House that focuses specifically on kind of contemporary politics and popular culture and its relationship to their ideas of like Christian concerns. And you can kind of, I won't go into all of these, but you can kind of see it like a general overview from the titles and the general framework based on kind of what I've said already. You've got counterpunch, the idea of like fighting back, the culture wars, cancel culture, the idea of the kind of the tensions, the cultural tensions in America. You've got Jezebel returning with the idea of Jezebel's kind of war with America. The ideas of Trump's aftershocks, the aftershocks of his election, ideas of kind of revival and revolution and rising in defense of Judeo-Christian values, the ideas of kind of Judeo-Christian civilization in contemporary America, but also just ideas of like revival more broadly. And these are kind of the narratives that really start to take hold, kind of in during the Trump presidency, but also after, and like leading into the kind of the contemporary Trump's re-election, the kind of contemporary political moment, where you get these ideas of like of kind of rising up, of creating religious revival, of staging a revolution in the soul and in the nation, of running into the fire, and like therefore like thereby kind of creating a new vision of America that is closely aligned with these very kind of Christian nationalistic reactionary ideas of kind of what America should be. Yeah, these are some other books that come out of this period. These are kind of, this is like a broad representation of kind of text that I selected. They each respond to kind of a different image of threat that emerges in this period. The idea of kind of threats to this like idea of kind of a Christian kind of Trumpist America. You've got Michael Yusuf's The Hidden Enemy, which focuses on ideas of like radical Islam, but also secularism as kind of dual threats to the individual believer and like the nation. Has a foreword by Eric Metaxas, who was a prominent speaker at the Jericho March that I talked about earlier, but is also a fairly prominent kind of conservative cultural commentator in the Catholic sphere at the moment. Brown's Jezebel War with America, which focuses on kind of Jezebel as a returning threat to the United States through like reproductive rights, through the growth of LGBT rights, through like things like the legalization of gay marriage and things like that, for example. The third book, Lawless, you may be able to tell from the cover, but this was written very directly in response to the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 that resulted after the murder of George Floyd. This is the end times war against the spirit of Antichrist. And like the spirit of Antichrist is also a spirit that comes up a lot in the anti-Islam books. But generally the idea is here that Antichrist is this demonic spirit within spiritual warfare that's kind of spreading hostility to Christianity and to kind of Christian institutions of power within America. This kind of overturning of law and order, essentially, um, in a way that these authors very closely align with the kind of struggle for Black civil rights from and the struggle for Black lives, like in contemporary America. Then lastly, we have Jonathan Cahn's The Return of the Gods. This is a very recent book. It sold very well. This was a New York Times bestseller, as many of Cahn's books actually are. And this book specifically, like, talks very closely. It's very focused on Christian Zionism. It's very focused on the relationship between America and Israel, but in a very spiritual warfare framework. For example, it frames America as beset by the same demonic spiritual entities that beset Israel in the kind of biblical narrative. So Baal, Moloch, Ashtaroth, like figures like that. And he frames them as returning to demonize contemporary America, specifically because he draws a very close parallel between Israel and America as the kind of alpha and omega of his construction of Western civilization and kind of Judeo-Christian values, Judeo-Christian civilization. Um, the idea that Cahn puts forward, which is an idea that you see quite prevalently in the right in general at the moment, particularly the global Christian right, this idea of Judeo-Christian civilization as under threat from a variety of internal and external forces, Islam, feminism, queer and trans people, secularism, pagan religions, a variety of other kind of forces. Um, and needing to be kind of defended against these forces, like by kind of Christian soldiers, essentially. And Cahn's very much like gives a kind of groundwork and lays the underlying framework that you see in a lot of that kind of literature and that discourse. And that brings me finally on to, or a number of those of you who saw Sam's tweet about this talk may recognize many of these headlines, but hopefully several of these will actually make a bit more sense now. You've got the J.D. Vance appearing with Woolnow, talking about Harris as the Jezebel spirit. You've got the idea of the Democrats as demonically influenced. You've got the idea of kind of voter fraud exorcisms, the idea that demons like operate through political processes that need to be kind of delivered and exercised. And then like down here in the corner, you have Tucker Carlson's claim that a demon attacked him. This is a very common narrative in some of the more self-helpy elements of spiritual warfare that I talked about earlier, but also in narratives like Mark Taylor's narrative of his kind of visions of Trump's coming presidency are like interspersed with kind of demonic forces haranguing him, like attacking him in his bed while he sleeps, things like that, which is very much kind of Tucker is kind of drawing on those kinds of narratives within this article. So that brings me finally on to kind of just a general point about where this is going. A lot of these forces, these kind of pro-Trump evangelical forces, have been broadly strengthened in his kind of absence from power, while there was kind of an initial knock against kind of support for him, and the idea that, but like, basically like underlying ideas around, say, conspiracies around the election being stolen, but also like the broader cultural and political agenda that a lot of these groups are oriented in, I think encapsulated very neatly by Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation project that kind of looks to instantiate various kind of Christian nationalist political and policy positions, like in contemporary United States, kind of, and sees Trump and Trump's second presidency as very much the framework or the entry point to kind of instantiate this kind of agenda. Um, but a lot of these forces are very much strengthened. They see Trump as a kind of divine um, tool for like these overthrowing of these kind of what they see as the kind of demonically influenced agendas of contemporary America, in a way that kind of I think is going to be quite concerning over the next few years as we see a lot of these agendas become like magnified and taken forward and kind of blossom in a way that maybe they weren't able to in the first presidency. Or alternatively, they could all wither and die in face of the forces of relentless capital. But we will see. Anyway, I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you, everybody, for um, coming. And I hope this talk was, if not probably not enjoyable, but enlightening and engaging. So thank you all.